No one in the quiet Cedar Ridge neighborhood expected a simple view to start a silent war. But by the end of the summer, one road would decide everything. Arthur Mitchell had lived in his Mountain Edge home for nearly 10 years. His backyard wasn't flashy or luxurious, but it had something priceless: tall cedar trees that framed the valley below. Every morning, sunlight filtered through the branches, and every evening the wind moved softly through the leaves. For Arthur, those trees were more than landscaping. They were part of the reason he bought the house. But his neighbors on the hill above him saw those trees differently. To them, the trees were an obstacle. The houses behind Arthur were newer, expensive homes with large glass windows built to capture a perfect mountain view. When those homes were built, the developers promised breathtaking scenery. But over time, Arthur's tall cedars grew even thicker, slowly blocking the panoramic view the new homeowners expected. At first, the complaints were quiet. A neighbor casually mentioned trimming them. Another suggested Arthur might consider removing a few of the taller ones. Arthur listened politely, but always gave the same calm answer. The trees were healthy, on his property, and he had no plans to remove them. Weeks passed, and the topic faded. Or so Arthur thought. One quiet morning, Arthur stepped outside with his coffee and froze. The ground behind his house looked wrong. Branches were scattered everywhere. The air smelled like fresh wood, and when he looked toward the property line, his heart dropped. 3 of his tallest cedar trees were gone, cleanly cut. Whoever did it had worked quickly, leaving nothing but raw stumps in silence. And standing there, staring at the empty sky where his trees once stood, Arthur realized something unsettling. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted the view. And someone had decided his trees were in the way. But what they didn't realize was something far more important. The road behind Arthur's land, the one those homes used every single day, wasn't theirs. It was his, and that discovery would soon change the entire neighborhood. The missing trees weren't the only surprise waiting for Arthur. What shocked him even more was how calm the neighborhood suddenly felt. Too calm. No apologies arrived. No explanations appeared. The homeowners uphill continued their routines as if nothing unusual had happened. Cars drove down the narrow gravel road behind Arthur's property every morning, heading toward the main street below. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but Arthur noticed something important while reviewing his property documents. That road, the narrow gravel road connecting the hillside homes to the main street. But when Arthur carefully checked the property map attached to his home purchase agreement, something unexpected appeared. The road wasn't part of the HOA property. It wasn't shared community land. It ran directly through Arthur's parcel. Technically, the neighbors only had access because Arthur had never restricted it. And suddenly, everything made sense. The trees had been cut for a better view from the houses above. But the people enjoying that view still relied on Arthur's land every day without thinking twice. Arthur stood by the old wooden fence, staring at the quiet gravel road. Cars rolled across it like they always had. Neighbors waved politely as they passed. None of them seemed aware that the ground beneath their tires belonged to the man whose trees had disappeared overnight. For a moment, Arthur considered confronting them, but something stopped him. Instead of reacting emotionally, he decided to wait. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't immediate anger. Sometimes it's patience. Arthur quietly contacted a land surveyor not to start a fight, just to confirm something very important. And when the survey results arrived a few days later, Arthur finally understood the picture. The entire road, every inch of it, was legally his property. And if the neighbors wanted a clear view so badly, they were about to learn the true value of respect. The surveyor arrived on a bright morning with measuring equipment and bright orange markers. Most neighbors didn't think much about it at first, but Arthur watched carefully as the boundaries were mapped out. Every measurement confirmed the same thing. The gravel road used by the hillside homes ran straight through his land. Legally, Arthur had allowed access for years simply because he had never needed to question it. Until now. Word started spreading through the neighborhood quickly. Curious residents stepped outside, whispering quietly while the survey crew worked along the edge of the road. By late afternoon, the orange boundary stakes formed a clear line. And that line told a story no one expected. Arthur owned the entire strip. Later that evening, Arthur received his first visit. Two neighbors from the hill approached his porch with cautious smiles. They explained how important the view had become for their homes. They said the trees had grown too tall and must have been removed by mistake during a landscaping job. Arthur listened politely, but he noticed something missing from the conversation: an apology. Not once did they admit responsibility. Instead, they spoke about property value, scenery, and neighborhood improvements. They treated the missing trees like an inconvenience that had simply happened. Arthur nodded thoughtfully and thanked them for stopping by. Then he asked one quiet question. "Did anyone ask before cutting trees on my land?" The silence that followed said everything. The neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, they muttered something about confusion and quickly left. That night, Arthur walked down the gravel road slowly, studying the tire tracks and the dust. He wasn't angry anymore, he was thinking. Because now he knew something the neighbors still didn't fully understand. Their beautiful hilltop homes had one practical route connecting them to the city below, that road. And that road belonged entirely to Arthur. By the next morning, construction trucks would begin arriving at his property. And the quiet Cedar Ridge neighborhood was about to discover just how important that little gravel road really was. When the first construction truck arrived, the neighborhood noticed immediately. Workers stepped out carrying wooden posts, metal fencing, and survey maps. The activity along the gravel road caught the attention of nearly everyone living on the hillside. Arthur stood nearby, calmly observing as the crew reviewed their instructions. The plan was simple, but the impact would be enormous. Over the years, that narrow road had quietly become the lifeline for the homes above Arthur's property. School buses used it. Delivery vans relied on it. Even emergency vehicles preferred the route because it was the fastest path down the hill. Yet very few people had ever asked who actually owned it. By midday, the workers began installing sturdy wooden posts along the road's edge. Curious neighbors slowly gathered near the property line. Someone finally asked the obvious question. "Arthur, what exactly are you building?" Arthur answered calmly, "A boundary." The word traveled through the group like a ripple. Another neighbor stepped forward, confusion written across his face. "But this road is for everyone." Arthur shook his head gently. "It has been," he said. The workers continued their job without interruption. More posts were placed, followed by sections of strong fencing that narrowed the road's usable space. Cars began slowing down as drivers realized something unusual was happening. By late afternoon, the once wide gravel road had been transformed into a narrow private lane that clearly passed through Arthur's land. But the most important piece hadn't been installed yet. Near the bottom of the hill, workers unloaded a heavy steel gate. Arthur watched as it was positioned carefully between two reinforced posts. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The road still existed, but it was no longer freely open. Neighbors whispered nervously, trying to understand what this meant for their daily routine. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, Arthur locked a gate for the first time. Tomorrow morning, the hillside residents would face a reality they had never considered before. Because the man whose trees had quietly disappeared now controlled the only road they depended on. Morning traffic on the hill was usually predictable. Coffee cups in hand, residents drove down the gravel road toward work, school, and the city below. But this morning, the routine stopped abruptly. The steel gate stood firmly across the road. Cars lined up quickly as drivers stepped out, staring at the unexpected barrier blocking their usual route. Confused voices filled the quiet hillside air. Someone tried the gate. It didn't move. Within minutes, several neighbors walked down the road toward Arthur's property. The same people who once asked him to remove his trees now stood staring at the locked entrance. Arthur stepped outside calmly. "What's going on?" one neighbor asked. Arthur pointed gently toward the wooden boundary markers and the survey signs placed along the road. "This is private property," he explained. The group fell silent. Another neighbor tried to reason with him. "But everyone uses this road." Arthur nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. Everyone did. He reminded them of something they had overlooked when his trees disappeared without permission. Property ownership matters. Respect matters. If someone crosses that line, the consequences can reach much further than expected. The neighbors realized something uncomfortable. Without Arthur's road, their alternative route required driving nearly 20 minutes around the mountain through a winding, poorly maintained road. School buses would struggle, delivery trucks might stop coming, emergency access would become slower. The inconvenience was immediate and undeniable. Finally, one homeowner asked the question no one wanted to admit: what would it take to reopen the road? Arthur didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced up toward the hillside homes, enjoying their now perfect valley view. The same view that appeared after 3 cedar trees vanished overnight. Then he spoke quietly. "First," he said, "we talk about the trees." And suddenly, the neighbors understood. The real conversation was only beginning. The meeting happened 2 days later. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood that the road situation needed a solution. The Cedar Ridge HOA board organized a small gathering at the community hall, hoping to resolve the tension before the situation escalated further. Arthur arrived quietly and took a seat near the back. Across the room sat several homeowners from the hilltop houses. Their windows now enjoyed a clear valley view, but their daily commute had become much longer since the road closure. Brenda Kensington, the HOA president, cleared her throat and began the discussion carefully. "We're here to find a resolution," she said. Arthur listened patiently as several residents spoke about access, convenience, and community cooperation. Some even suggested that the road should remain open for the sake of neighborhood harmony. Finally, Arthur stood. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he simply held up photographs. Pictures of the missing cedar trees, clean stumps, fresh-cut marks. The room grew quiet. He explained how those trees had stood on his property for years. He described how they disappeared without permission, without discussion, and without a single apology. Then he reminded everyone of the survey results. The road, the land beneath it, and the gate all belonged legally to him. Arthur wasn't interested in revenge, but he was interested in fairness. He made one simple proposal. The neighbors responsible for cutting the trees would cover the cost of replacing them with mature cedar trees. They would also formally acknowledge Arthur's property rights moving forward. If that happened, the road would reopen. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one homeowner slowly stood up and finally admitted what everyone already suspected. The trees had been removed to improve the view, but now the neighborhood faced a decision: respect the property they once ignored, or continue living with a closed road that changed everything. The agreement came faster than anyone expected. Once the truth was spoken aloud in the meeting room, the atmosphere shifted completely. The homeowners who had quietly benefited from the missing trees realized the situation had reached a turning point. Convenience had collided with responsibility, and responsibility finally won. Within a week, professional landscapers arrived at Arthur's property. Large trucks delivered mature cedar trees, carefully selected to match the ones that had been removed. Workers spent hours planting them along the property line, restoring the natural barrier that once framed the valley view. The hillside homes would still see the mountains, but the trees would grow again, slowly reclaiming the skyline. Just as important, the HOA board officially recognized Arthur's ownership of the gravel road. A written agreement ensured that access would continue with mutual respect moving forward. The steel gate remained in place, but now it stayed open. Neighbors who once passed through without thinking now waved respectfully when they drove by. The quiet understanding between them carried a different tone than before. Not fear, not resentment, just awareness. Because sometimes the strongest boundaries aren't built with fences or gates. They're built with lessons. And Arthur's lesson had been simple. A beautiful view may seem valuable, but respect for someone else's property is worth far more. The hillside neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful routine. The roads stayed open. The trees grew stronger each season, and the story of the missing cedars became a reminder shared quietly among new residents. Some lessons travel further than anger ever could. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. Please subscribe to HOA Conflicts.